Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. I reread the words of the letter once more to make sure my eyes hadn't deceived me. I thought to myself, how is this even possible? Though there was this nagging pinch on my brain that was a not so subtle nudge that told me I had actually kind of been expecting this. Nevertheless, I tried to convince myself that perhaps I had missed some important detail or misunderstood the meaning of the words in the letter, but every time I scanned the text printed on the official university letterhead, the words were still there, taunting me, judging me, accusing me. You have been placed on academic probation. I was standing in the kitchen at my parents' house just a couple of days into the summer break after my second semester of my freshman year at Kansas State University. And when I received the letter in the mailbox, I assumed that it was my report card from the semester. But as it turns out, had it actually been my report card, I would have at least gotten some advanced warning of what was to come. You see, I knew the semester had been a rough one for me. Less than a year into my journey as a civil engineering major in college, I was lost. I was struggling, and most of all, I was deeply unhappy. I felt disconnected from my major. It wasn't interesting to me. The classes might as well have been in some advanced foreign language. I mean, when math becomes all X's and Y's and funky symbols, you have lost me. And I was lost, for sure. I knew my grades that semester or that year weren't going to be great, but as my first year of college came to a close, I did hold out some hope that my final exams would give me a boost. But the letter that I was holding, outlining my status as a student being placed on academic probation, that pretty much poked a gaping hole in that life preserver, and the air was escaping fast. As it turns out, I got a C in my engineering graphics class. The first time in my life, actually, that I'd ever gotten a grade lower than an A. But it didn't stop there. It got lower. Chemistry 2 came along and delivered a gut punch. That was a D, which means I'd have to retake the class. Calculus 3 dealt the knockout blow to my grades and to my ego, an F. This dropped my grade point average to a mere measly 1.9, which triggered my probationary status. And one more semester below a 2.0, and I would be kicked out of college. So there I was, holding the letter, and at that moment, I felt like my head was barely above water, and every gasp that I tried to take was just met with waves of overwhelm and disorientation. Whatever hope I had of making it as a civil engineering major had pretty much evaporated like water on asphalt on a hot Kansas summer day. And if you know, you know. It's a funny thing, though, the stories we tell ourselves, even when faced with a reality as dire as being kicked out of college. We bargain with ourselves and try to find ways to excuse away what we know to be true. Because after all, I was the valedictorian of my high school class. I had received straight A's all my life, and I had earned numerous academic scholarships for college. People like me don't flunk out of college, so I have to keep going. That's what I told myself. Humans have a destructive little tendency to refuse to abandon our chosen path or our course of action because we have invested so much into it, so much time, energy, effort, belief into a path or course of action, despite the fact that we would greatly benefit from walking away and trying something new. It's called the sunk cost fallacy. And in this instance, despite my non existent passion for my major, as I've already outlined, and despite living under the threat of expulsion, I convinced myself to persist. Now, before I go any further, I want to detail how I got to that moment. It really was the sum of years of listening to other people and then creating an identity off of those expectations, even though it really didn't truly align with who or what I wanted to be. And in this instance, a civil engineer. Because as I mentioned, I was a great student from grade school through high school. I excelled at everything from math to writing to debate to Spanish. I aced it all. Straight A's, 4.0 grade point average, valedictorian. And when it came time to apply for colleges in high school, K State was my first and only choice. Generations of my family graduated from K State, including my grandpa, my dad, my older sister. I wasn't even a student yet, and I knew every detail of the K State campus. I visited countless times, and I'd imagined myself as a student there for years, even before I became college aged. But because K State is known for being one of the better engineering schools in the world, and because I got perfect grades in math and science, on top of the fact that I absolutely loved building things out of Lego, my teachers, my school counselors, my friends, and a lot of my family all assumed that I would go to K State to be an engineer. And I fell in line with that thinking. And I never stopped to ask if that's what I wanted. Now, had I done so, I would have admitted that, sure, I was good at math and science, but I also really enjoyed writing and speaking and storytelling and creative outlets like drawing and photography. I was good at a lot of things, but the things that interested me the most had gone unconsidered for so long because of other people's expectations for my life. And so I became hamstrung. I became caught up in the sunk cost fallacy, that I have gone so long under this veil of expectation that it's become my identity, that I've argued for it, that I have made it a point to tell others, this is what I'm going to do. And I've set my life's course on that. I've invested so much of that time, energy, effort, belief into my path as a civil engineer that I could see no other path forward. And to deviate from that felt wrong, dangerous, unknown, unnecessary, perhaps even a little bit scary. And so, one of the things that I want you to rethink when it comes to how this relates to communication is this, it's really twofold. When you consider the sunk cost fallacy, first, in understanding what it is, it can offer you an opportunity to explore your own perspective and consider where maybe you could be wrong or perhaps misaligned, or even to take it a little bit further, perhaps you don't have the full picture of something that you're faced with. Maybe it's a disagreement, maybe it's a conflict at work. But the first thing that we do when we understand sunk cost fallacy is exactly that. It's an opportunity for you to look inward at yourself and understand what you truly believe. Now, I said it's twofold. The second part is it gives you an idea of what you're up against when you're trying to persuade someone else to change course or a behavior or to get someone to change their mind. And so, for the remainder of this episode, I want to go into these 2 points. These 2 points of understanding the sunk cost fallacy and what they have to do with how you communicate with the world. In my book, Can I Ask a Question? And in episode 111, where I explain the ask then see approach to conflict communication, the K in ask then see, in that methodology, is know that you don't know everything. Ask is assume positive intent, set aside your ego. And the K is know that you don't know everything. And it is this awareness of your limitations in understanding everything that there could possibly be, every perspective or every opportunity that there could be out there. When we look at sunk cost fallacy and our tendency as humans to want to continue to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and just fight through an issue, or a challenge, even when we know it's not working out for us, it often happens because we are limited in our perspective and we have not done the work to fully understand all of our options. It reminds me of a recent episode that I did with Vikram Mancharamani in episode 133. I'm going to play you a quote here from Vikram, where he talks about this collection of our experiences and forcing ourselves into this uncomfortable place of knowing that we don't know everything.
We're all a collection of our experiences. We're all a collection of the exposures we've had to parents, teachers, books, movies, and everything in between. I have forced myself to be a generalist, to be wide eyed, to be broad minded, to actually force myself into areas of discomfort to learn. And that I think has made me see that there are multiple perspectives on everything. I have come to the conclusion that every perspective is biased, every perspective is limited, and every perspective is incomplete. So, why not employ multiple perspectives?
That final point that Vikram made, that every perspective is biased, limited, and incomplete, is so incredibly important for you and I and everyone to understand. Because when we are talking about creating an identity around the things that we believe, around the ways that we think the world could and should work for us, or perhaps the ways that it is working against us, when we understand that our own perspective is biased, limited, and incomplete, it puts a measure of force on you to go and find those gaps, to go and try as much as you can to fill in those gaps, to fill in those holes of your unawareness. Now, for me, in my journey to be a civil engineer in college and eventually getting put in on academic probation, as I mentioned, I had created this identity off of those expectations where I was going to be the civil engineer because I was good at math and science. It's what people told me. I was going to a school that was well known in civil engineering. And so I fell in line with that. And like I mentioned earlier, when you argue for something or where you voice something out to the public, it is infinitely harder to get you to change or deviate from that path. Because what do we want to do? We want to save face. We want to, I used the phrase earlier, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. I'm a Midwest guy. That is a thing in the Midwest. When you are hit with a challenge, when you are hit with a obstacle, when you're hit with discomfort, when you're hit with something that's just not working, well, by God, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and just go get it done. Push through. And there is value in that. But what we're really talking about here is self awareness. And that is what the first part of the Ask Then See methodology is asking of you, is to own a level of responsibility to be self aware, to assume positive intent, not just in others, but in yourself, to set aside your ego, to know that your ego is a protective device. And sometimes it goes into hyperdrive, into overdrive, perhaps, and doesn't let you see all of those other ways that your perspective is biased, limited, and incomplete. It's like a curtain, a veil that is placed in front of you that says, look, you're right. You are certain you are right, and you got to keep going. And if you do that, then of course you kind of feel like you know everything there is to know. When we question that identity, when we question what we've been brought up to believe and think, when we question a lot of these things that feel like a part of our character, as Doc Corey Yeager talked about in episode 92 here of this show, it feels like you are going against the makeup of who you are. In fact, here's what Doc said in episode 92. It almost feels like you're being a traitor to your upbringing. But then we must ask ourselves the next question: what is more important? Me showing loyalty in a space where I know I don't believe in it anymore, or being more true to who I am now? Which one is more important? And we get to answer. I would hope that we can find the gumption to invite this dissonance in because it means we're growing and that we are aware. This ties right in nicely with that quote from Vikram that we heard earlier. What he said, when we lean into that discomfort, when we lean into, as Doc put it, that dissonance, because we see it's an area where perhaps our perspective is biased, limited, and incomplete. And maybe you do this work. Maybe you do this work of self awareness and you figure out that, yes, I do want to keep pushing through. And there is some level of keeping the peace about you and about your life. There is some level of value in that. Fully agree. But when we talk about sunk cost fallacy and the way that we communicate our beliefs and ideas to the world, if they have changed, if they have evolved, what we have to overcome then is how do we work through that decision point? Do I keep on the path that I am continuing down, or do I change? Do I present to the world a different viewpoint, a different belief, maybe not even drastically different, maybe just a shift? But do I, in my mind, I'm thinking this is perhaps the narrative in my mind. Do I abandon what I have said that I stood for so long, who have said that I am for so long, because it more aligns with my beliefs now? There are 3 questions that you can ask yourself to help you navigate this decision point. The first is, what do I want? There are other questions that we can ask in this same vein. What do I actually believe and how did I come to those beliefs? What does this mean to me? There are other questions that we can ask there, but it really comes down to, look, what do I want from my life, from my career, from my pursuits and my passions, for myself and my family? What do I truly want? Answer that question and then go into the second question, which is, how are others affected? How would others be affected by this decision if I changed my mind, if I shifted just a little bit? Not saying that it has to be a complete 180 from where you're at now to where you want to go or where you think you want to go, but how are others affected? If others are negatively affected, then you have a decision to make. And by negatively affected, I mean somebody is hurt physically, somebody is financially on the hook, and may be affected in that way. I was recently coaching a TEDx speaker, and she is a Indian immigrant to the United States, and she asked the question in her TEDx talk, "Well, who has the privilege to fail?" She had well-off parents who, when she failed out of medical school, again, you want to talk about setting expectations and creating an identity. Immigrant families often have that expectation placed on their children to go into these pursuits like law or medicine. And when she failed out of medical school, she got to go home and exist and relax and figure out the rest of her life. Whereas many immigrants, the parents are relying on their children to lift their family up out of a certain position or status with their job. So there is a level of expectation, and the question must be asked, who can fail? So when you go back to that second question, how are others affected? If your family is dependent on you succeeding, then perhaps the decision is not so cut and dry as it might appear from the outside, when it perhaps is not aligned with what you want. To go back to that first question, these are nuanced, these are complex decisions, right? But they all contribute to sunk cost fallacy. And the third question is, if I remain on the path that I'm on, am I growing and am I learning, or am I creating frustration? Am I creating anxiety? Am I stagnant? For me, if I were if I were honest with myself as I was going through my civil engineering classes, I was frustrated. I was absolutely anxious because I wasn't getting the material, and nor did I want to get the material. And so I was stagnant. I was not learning. I was not growing. It was not the path that I could ultimately see myself following for the rest of my life. So no, I was not learning and growing. But again, sunk cost fallacy tells us that if I were to keep going down that direction, Well, I have to because I've invested all this money. I have these scholarships. I have people that I've told I'm going to be a civil engineer and all these expectations and this identity that I've created. I have to keep pushing through. When my answers to these questions, what do I want? Well, it's not this. How are others affected? They might be disappointed. They might be a little upset. They might be wondering why, but they're not deeply affected in any harmful way. And no, I was not growing and learning. I was creating frustration, anxiety, and stagnation. Now, the way that this relates again to our communication is even when we know that we are not following the path that we want to, or that we no longer have the beliefs that we have stated before, or that we no longer align with how things are run at the company where we work, we just keep going back to that. "Mm, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and push through it, even when we know we're misaligned. And so the way that we communicate that out to others is misaligned with our internal beliefs, with our internal systems that are telling us that something's wrong here and our alarm bells are going off. So that's point one. Understanding sunk cost fallacy is an opportunity to explore your own perspective and consider how you are showing up in the world and if that is misaligned. And if it is, you have to ask those three questions. What do I want? How are others affected? And am I growing and learning, or am I creating frustration, anxiety, and stagnation? This leads into point two. Understanding sunk cost fallacy gives you an idea of what you're up against when you're trying to bring about change. Because listen, so often we think that the way to bring about change, to persuade someone, to get them to change their mind or change their behavior, we think it comes down to facts, that they just don't have enough facts. The facts as we see them, as I see them. If they just knew this, well, then they would change their mind. And that's not what it is. The thing that you have to overcome is the fact that if they change their mind, they will feel as if they are idiots for believing what they believed for so long. They will feel like they will be made to look and feel like a fool when faced with the reality that perhaps the ways that they were aligned in the past, or the things that they did believe in the past, or the path that they chose for their life or for their actions was not the ideal, or was actually hurting them more than helping them. If you come at them with that energy, with that motive to make them feel like a fool for believing those things, for aligning themselves in that way for so long, people will dig in even more. Making others out to be idiots will never change their minds or change their behavior. And so you have to rethink how you communicate to them. Because go back to my whole example of point one, knowing that you don't know everything and aligning with this identity. If you have so aligned with that identity and then someone comes along trying to make you feel like an idiot for aligning with that identity for very good reasons, remember, assume positive intent. You aligned yourself with that identity for very good reasons. For me, I wanted to go to K-State. I wanted to be the next in line in my family to graduate from K-State, and I was good in math and science, so I was aligning myself with all these expectations. And changing course would be admitting defeat, would be admitting that I couldn't hack it, would be admitting that for a valedictorian, I wasn't smart enough, perhaps. That's some of the story that I was telling myself. And so if somebody came along and made me out to be an idiot, well, I'm not going to change my mind. I'm digging in. I will prove you wrong. And that can be incredibly motivating to some people. Absolutely. But it helps you none when it comes to persuasion, trying to change behavior, bring about some sort of change of mind. It's not a lack of facts. It's sunk cost and not wanting to look like a fool or feel like you've wasted time, money, energy, and emotion. That is the hurdle that you have to get over in how you communicate to others. Michael McQueen, back in episode 125, talked about this loss of dignity or self.
And so I think that's the sort of loss that often keeps us bound up, that sense of losing our sense of dignity or self. And the moment that that feels like it's impinged on, that's when we, again, we dig our heels in, even if deep down we know that what someone else is saying is probably right and would even benefit us. We'll still fight back. And we all know people not like that. You can actually present to them a reason to change that they're going to benefit massively from, and they'll still fight you on it. And you think, wow, isn't that interesting? So, well, why don't smart people change? Even when they want to, even when they know they should, what keeps us fixed or stuck or rigid?
Here's what it comes down to. We know that in order for change to occur, the cost of staying the same has to be higher, has to be greater than the cost of change, or else we won't do it. If it doesn't cost me more in money, in time, in happiness to stay stagnant and stay the same or continue down the path that I've chosen, if it doesn't cost me more to do that than actually see some sort of change, I'm not going to do it. And that cost can also mean how I'm viewed by others, the worth that I feel that I have, and my dignity. I have to be able to keep my dignity or sense of self. That is a cost within this equation that you must understand. It requires a different approach than just pointing out all that is wrong with someone else's views or beliefs. And this is where questions help. This is where your curiosity can lead the conversation rather than certainty. This is the C, the SEE in the ask then see approach to conflict communication. Search yourself, like we've already talked about. Examine other perspectives. We've already talked about that. Now exchange your curiosity with others. And in fact, again, to go back to Michael McQueen in that conversation in episode 125, he has a wonderful approach and methodology to begin to point this curiosity in the direction of someone else.
I would start by firstly affirming that, like, that perspective, like, you get it. You understand why they would think that. And there's this, this adage they've used in sales for years. And I first learned this at university in a persuasive communication course. It was like feel, felt, found. I know how you feel. I felt the same way. Here's what I found. And that little process of often overcoming objections from a sales perspective also works from a persuasion standpoint. Because the first point is you go, like, I get it. I a lot of people think that. That's not an uncommon thought, because that does is it affirms dignity. In other words, you're not an idiot for thinking this. But then it's like, well, I actually felt the same way. I thought the same thing. Until what I found was I read something and for me, at first I'm like, I didn't want to believe it. But I'm like, the more I looked at it, the more I considered it, the more I thought there's something here. And what I found is actually that there's a lot of research about this, blah, blah, blah. So feel, felt, found is a good approach. Also asking people questions about how did you, like, for you, how did you get to the point where you were so sure about that? Like, was there an experience or was there something you read? And often when you get people to pause long enough to think about how they arrived at their points of opinion or points of view, often they're like, "I don't know, actually. I don't even know when I even started thinking this as a thing." And even that moment, that's not gonna change their mind in that moment, but it opens the door, it softens them up because there's that sense that, okay, if I don't have a reason for thinking what I think, maybe I'm just open enough a little bit to consider that maybe there are things that I haven't thought of. There's a more full picture I haven't considered.
So, to bring this back to my college career, that summer after my first year of college, I interned with the Kansas Department of Transportation, working on a road construction project that was excruciatingly boring. And rather than getting me excited about the future potential of my life after college, the internship devoured whatever scraps of passion I had left. I came back to my sophomore year at K State wholly uninterested in my chosen field of study, but hellbent on pulling myself up by my bootstraps and gritting through it. It's sunk cost fallacy, y'all. I was miserable and yet still tried to persist. My grades in the first semester of my sophomore year improved slightly, just enough to keep me from getting expelled, but my two lowest grades that semester came in my two engineering classes. So, to anyone else, the signs would have been obvious. The facts were there. Had you asked me if I liked what I was doing, I would have told you I hated civil engineering and could never see myself actually completing the requirements of the degree. The facts were there, and yet I persisted. And at the end of the fall semester, over Christmas break of my sophomore year, I finally began asking myself some hard questions. Am I happy? Can I see myself being successful on this current path? Even if I somehow managed to scrape by and graduate, then what? Could I really work as a civil engineer for the rest of my life? Is this what I even wanted in the first place? Finally, in a moment of honesty that felt like climbing onto a lifeboat after being lost at sea, the answer to each one of these questions was, without a doubt, no. I changed my major. I got into mass communications and journalism. I graduated with a 3.2 GPA. I improved my GPA that much because I was in what I loved to do. And in fact, I just graduated with my master's degree in mass communications. The opportunities to bring out real positive change in your life or in the life of someone else can happen. You just have to ask a few questions to kickstart the process. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Rethinking Communication. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought. Email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com or go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there and let me know, or email me with any questions that you have if you want to talk through any of this. Also, I'm on LinkedIn the most in terms of social media, so you can find me on LinkedIn. The link will be in the show notes to my profile. Let's connect there and let's continue the conversation about sunk cost fallacy and how we can bring about real positive change when we rethink how we communicate. Do me a favor and share this episode with your network. Help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions and about rethinking what we've been taught about how to communicate well with each other. And until the next episode here of Rethinking Communication, I've got one thing to ask of you, and that is to keep asking questions.